So this week in lecture, we'll be covering the rest of plant and seed morphology, so going over all the terms that you need to know to help you key out your plants. And then we will start looking into what a dichotomous key is and how dichotomous keys work. And that's the type of key that your text uses and that you'll be using to key out all of your plants.
So here we've got the various parts that you'll see on a twig or the stem of the plant or the tree or shrub. And at the very end of the twig, you have the terminal bud, and that's just the bud that's going to grow into new leaves at the very tip of the stem or the branch. Lateral buds are buds growing off the side, and pseudo-terminal buds are buds that appear to be terminal, but they're actually lateral buds. Submerged buds are buds that are buried in the leaf scar or where the leaf fell off, so they're kind of buried down in the twig. A bud scale is just a small modified leaf covering the bud, and a leaf scar is a scar left on the twig where the leaf falls off, so you might see a little indentation there where the leaf fell off. Nodes and internodes are, the node is the place where the leaf attaches, and the internode is the space between the two leaves. So in some plants, the internode distance or the place between two leaves might be important to keying out the plant. The lenticule is a quirky spot on the bark where air can get into the stem, and the pith is just the very center or the soft portion of the twig. Okay, next we have bud scale types, and there's 3 different types. The left picture shows valvate bud scales, where the 2 bud scales are just directly facing each other. The middle picture shows imbricate bud scales, or overlapping like shingles. And then on the right-hand side, we have naked buds, which don't have scales and they just have leaves on the outside to protect them. There are 3 different types of buds, and the type of bud is just what the bud is going to grow into. So if it's going to grow into leaves or flowers, leaf buds grow into leaves, flower buds are going to grow into flowers, and mixed buds are going to grow into leaves and flowers. And examples of these are like a blackberry bush. And each of these have modified leaves or leaf scales on the outside of the bud. So sometimes they can all look similar from the outside, and you can't tell what type of bud it's going to be unless you look at the inside. So shoots are just twigs growing off of the main stem of a tree. And here we'll go over 2 different types of shoots that your book uses. One is spur shoots, and these are very short shoots. And if you remember on the other slide, we talked about the internode is the space between leaves. Well, this is where there essentially isn't a space between the leaves. So all the leaves occur right next to each other. And when these leaves fall off, they leave leaf scars behind. So on a spur shoot, usually you'll just see a bunch of leaf scars very close together and on a short stem there. A lammus shoot is essentially when a shoot grows, you'll get one shoot growing out for the year, and as the leaves on that shoot get bigger, a new little bud will appear at the leaf base. Usually this bud will grow the following year, but in a lammus shoot, the buds actually start growing into a new secondary shoot in the middle of the summer of that same year. So usually you'll see that shoot, the first shoot coming on in the spring, and then the lammus shoot will grow midsummer rather than waiting until the following spring, when in most plants that secondary shoot would grow. Here we have spines, thorns, and prickles, and they all may look somewhat similar and sharp and pointed, but the difference between these is what they're made from, so whether they're made from leaves or modified branches or outgrowth of the bark. So spines are just modified leaves, and thorns are modified branches. They're usually more long and slender. And prickles are very slender outgrowths of the epidermis or the bark. An example of this would be the raspberry. Sometimes the pith or the center of the stem is useful in keying out the plant. The pith can have different shapes, like triangular, star-shaped, or rounded. And it can also have different textures on the inside. So solid is just where it's unbroken throughout. Spongy is sort of soft and porous, which may look similar to chambered, but in spongy there's sort of that spongy material all throughout the center. Chambered resembles sort of a hollow ladder, so those spaces between all those little cross sections are hollow. And in hollow, it's completely open in the very center. Bark can also be useful for keying out your plant. Your book says that it's best observed in the field, but you may not have the time or be able to get through the key in the field. So I would recommend taking some notes of the color and how the bark looks, taking some close-up and some distance pictures, and looking at the inner and the outer bark. So the outer bark may have a slightly different look than if you peel back a little piece of the bark and look deeper in. Just make some notes of that, take some pictures so you'll have that information later on when you try to key your plant if you are going to key them at home. So we finally made it through all the plant terms. You're definitely not expected to memorize all of these terms, but I hope that between the book and my notes, you'll be able to understand the terms as you get to them in the key. So, if you're going through the key and you don't understand your book, I would come back and reference these notes, see if that helps you. If not, feel free to ask questions at any time, because it definitely can get confusing when you try to start applying these terms and working through the key. So I want to go over a quick review of taxonomy, just so that you understand as we're keying these plants out what these terms, if you're not already familiar with them, what we mean when we say class or family or genus. So taxonomy just refers to classifying an organism or a living thing, and we're trying to classify our plants down to genus and species. So about as specific as you can go in knowing what the plant is. From most broad to most specific, kingdom is the most broad. So we have like the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, the fungus kingdom, and then of course we'll just be dealing with kingdom Plantae, or the plant kingdom, in this class. And then as you start going more specific, there's different types of phylum, and then it's class, order, family, genus, species, and species is the most specific. So for all conifers are kingdom Plantae, phylum Coniferophyta, which is the conifers, class Pinnate, and then there's two different orders that the conifers fall into. Most conifers are order Coniferales, and then there's a few that are order Taxales. And then if you go more specific than order, you have all of your different families. So for example, in Coniferales we have family Pinaceae, family Cupressaceae, and in order Taxales we have family Taxaceae. And then you have your different genuses and your different species. So we'll cover more on these later as we get into gymnosperms and angiosperms. We'll cover a lot more on the different families and identifying them, but this is just an overview of all of those terms. So when you key out plants, you use something called a dichotomous key, and the word di just means two. So it's a key where you have two choices for each question. So at the very beginning of the key, usually there's number one, and there's two number ones, and you choose the statement that best fits your plant. So really following the key is pretty simple. You just read the statement, you pick which one is best, and it tells you which number to move to after that. Sometimes knowing what the right choice is on the key can be very hard. So don't feel discouraged if you're having a hard time getting through the key, especially at first, and trying to apply a lot of terms all at once. So just plan on taking your time on that. And what I'd like to do is just first I'll go through a juniper with you, and then what I'd like you all to try to do is collect a juniper around where you are and see if you can key that out, and just practice putting some of these terms to use. That'll get one plant down for your plant collection, and we will all be working on hopefully the same plant and can answer questions if you have questions as you go through the key. So this picture on the right is a picture of the juniper that I collected from, and next I'll go through keying that out in your book. So the key to the junipers actually starts on page 35. If you didn't know that the plant you had collected was a juniper, then you would need to start on that key on page 35 and get through that, and it would take you to junipers. I'm hoping that you all do know what a juniper looks like. If you don't, let me know, and we can get you started on that. But if you do know what a juniper looks like and are able to collect a juniper around where you live, that would be great. And then the key to the junipers is on page 97 in your book. And I just want to run through this key once just to give you an example of how it works and let you try out a plant near where you are and just get through one plant together. So if you have a juniper, you'll just start at at the very top there on the number 1 and read the 2 options. So first we have, are the leaves all shaped or linear to lanceolate, or are they scale-like? And the juniper that I collected, the leaves are definitely scale-like and very pressed or close to the twig. And then it gives you another option, or scale and all like, but they are scale-like, so we're going to go with that second number 1 here. And on the right hand side there, it tells you to go on to number 2. So then you'll read the 2 options for number 2. And are the leaves conspicuously resin dotted, or are they not resin dotted? And these are definitely resin dotted. It actually was hard to see on just looking with your naked eye, some of these things. It helps to be able to have a magnifying glass, or what I did was I took a picture, zoomed way in on the picture, and then it was pretty easy to see the resin dots on that. So that first choice for number 2 is the best fit, and that means it's Juniperus occidentalis, which is Western or Sierra juniper. And then if you go to, that plant is found on page 100 in your book. It'll give you a description of the leaves and the cones and the twigs, and sometimes if you're not sure that you followed the key right, it's a good idea to read through those descriptions and make sure that your tree or shrub fits all of those descriptions. If it doesn't seem to fit at all, then you might have made a misstep somewhere on the key and might want to try going back and see if you can get to a different choice that might be a better fit. And just for information, a lot of times in a key or an article, or if you're working somewhere on a form, it's common practice just to put the first letter of the genus and then write out the species name after that. So once you've established that it is a juniper, they'll just put J. occidentalis or J. californica, and J there stands for juniper. So you'll see that a lot where that first letter of the genus name is abbreviated. So we briefly started covering dichotomous keys last week. Just to review, a dichotomous key starts with the word di. Di means 2, so essentially it's a key where there are 2 choices to make at each step. The beginning steps are usually general characteristics, and as you move through the key, the characteristics get more and more specific to the plant that you're working on. Your goal when following the key is to get to the name of the plant. And once you get to the name of the plant, then you stop at that point on the key and don't continue going any further. So here's a real quick non-plant example just to go through a sample dichotomous key. So at step 1, you have the choice: you are younger than 18 or you are older than 18. If you are older than 18, which I'd assume most of us are, then you will go on to the number on the right. It says go on to 3, so you'll move to question number 3. And question number 3 says you are a female or you are a male. And if you're female, then your name for this key would be female adult. If you are a male, your name would be male adult. So once you get to that final step where you're given that name, then at that point you can stop on the key. And this is just a really simple example just to go through those steps, and now we'll go ahead and work on a plant example going through the key next. So essentially your textbook Manual of Oregon Trees and Shrubs is just a large key to plants, and the first thing that you need to know for this book is whether your plant is a conifer or a broadleaf tree or shrub. If you're doing a conifer, you'll go to the key on page 35, and then the key to the broadleaf trees and shrubs is on page 107. First we'll go through this tree here. Hopefully you can tell by looking at this that it's a conifer. And even if you already know what this is just by looking at it, let's go ahead and work through the key here and just to get practice going through the key. The conifer key starts on page 35, so if you were working through this plant, you go ahead and go to page 35. And choice number 1 is, are the leaves scale-like, all-like, or both? And the other choice is that the leaves are not as above. They may be linear, acicular, or lanceolate. The tip on the upper right-hand corner states that usually the traits at the beginning of the question are the most important ones. As the statement goes on, it gives more details to help you in case you couldn't get that first characteristic there. But if you are able to tell from the first few words of that segment what your plant is, then you really don't need to move on. So if you have leaves or scale-like, and you can tell by the picture down there in the lower right-hand corner that the leaves are definitely scale-like, you really don't have to worry about going through the arrangement or any of the other things in the key there. So for number 1, the leaves are scale-like, and if you follow that over to the right-hand side, it says it has a number 2 there, and that means that we're going to go on to question number 2. The leaves do not fit the bottom statement, which would lead us to number 7, so we're not going to go to number 7. You'll follow the key through to question number 2. So question number 2 asks if the spray of foliage, or essentially a segment of several twigs and leaves, lies flat or does not lie flat. And if you can tell from the picture here, it looks like the leaves coming off the branch are flat. So that would mean that we're going to move on to number 5. Number 5 asks you to find 4 leaves near the end of the branchlet, and remember, a scale is a leaf. So you look at that segment in the very upper right hand corner of 4 scales or 4 leaves, and it says that they're several times longer than wide. They overlap and resemble a wine goblet where they meet. The second statement there says that the set of 4 leaves are not as above, that they're about as long as they are wide. So these are clearly much longer. That segment of 4 is much longer than it is wide. Remember, you're looking at that whole segment of 4. And in the upper statement, it says the cones are about 1 inch long. When they are open, they resemble a flying goose, and when they're closed, they resemble a duck's bill. So that looks pretty much like our cones for this plant. When they're open and closed, they look like that shape, and they are longer than wide. So that's going to lead us to the genus name of Callicedrus, which is incense cedar. And once you know the genus name, it will tell you the page number to go to for the key for that genus in order to get the entire species name. So we'll go ahead and move on to page 91. So let's key through one more plant just to get you familiar with going a different pathway through the key. We'll go ahead and do a conifer again. So you'll go back to page 35 on your key, and it asks you again, are the leaves scale-like, all-like, or both, or not as above? They may be linear, acicular, or lanceolate. And just to refresh your memory from earlier week's lectures, acicular means needle-like, and these leaves are definitely needle-like, so that would lead us to the second number 1 there, which tells us to go to question number 7. Question number 7 asks if the needles are born in clusters, such as a fascicle, which is a bundle of needles, or if all the needles are born individually, so each needle is connected directly to the twig, separate from each other. And this tree here has needles that are in a fascicle or a cluster. So we're going to move on to question number 8. Question number 8 asks if the needle clusters bear 2 to 5 needles or more than 10 needles per cluster. And if you look at this needle cluster here, or fascicle, it has 3 needles coming off of it, and that's going to lead us to the genus Pinus, which is on page 48. So we'll go ahead and go to page 48 and do the key in that section. Next, it asks if there are 5 needles per fascicle or 2 or 3 needles per fascicle, and this has 3 needles per fascicle. So that's going to lead us on to number 5. Number 5 asks if there are 2 needles per fascicle or 2 or 3 needles per fascicle. So this is one where if there were 2 needles per fascicle, you would want to read the rest of the statement. But since we have 3 needles per fascicle, it only fits with that second number 5. So we'll go ahead and move on to question number 6. For number 6, we've got 3 needles per fascicle, which could fit either the top or the bottom choice. So this is an example of where you need to move on to the second characteristic. And our needles are 8 inches long, which would fit in the 5 to 11 inch category best. And they are a little more blue-green colored, so that would fit the second category here best. And we'll move on to number 7. On number 7, our cones are 4 inches, this particular cone is 4 inches long, so that's in the 3 to 5 inch long category. And the scales do have straight prickles on them, meaning the prickles stick out. And when you grab the actual pine cone, it will most likely poke your fingers. So this would fit under Ponderosa pine best. And just a few tips if you're out in the field and you're trying to tell the difference between a Ponderosa pine and a Jeffrey pine. The Ponderosa pine, like I said, it will usually feel prickly when you pick up the pine cone, and that gives it the nickname Prickly Ponderosa. And the Jeffrey pine cones, their prickles kind of curve in so that it has the nickname Gentle Jeffrey. And also the Jeffrey pine bark has a sweet sort of vanilla or butterscotch smell, and it usually grows at higher elevations. So if you feel the cone, smell the bark, and you're not getting that kind of sweet vanilla or butterscotch smell, then it's probably and it's prickly, then you're probably Ponderosa pine. Since we know that this was a Ponderosa pine, we're done with our keying. We have our name, Pinus ponderosa or Ponderosa pine, and that's the end of example number 2.
So next, let's go over what you need to be doing for your lab this week. And in lab this week, you'll be collecting 2 conifers and then drying them in your press. You don't need to know the names of the conifers this week. You'll be attempting to key out your conifers in next week's lab, but I'm going to go over how to collect your plant samples, how to dry them, and then what pictures you'll need to take and submit for your lab this week. Let's cover real quick what a conifer is. And conifers are plants that for the most part have cones where the seeds are grown. So if you look at the picture here on the right, this is a type of a pine, Ponderosa pine, and you can see the typical pine cone structure that you would typically think of with conifers. Now some conifers don't produce the exact cone-like structures like the juniper trees. They have these things that we tend to call juniper berries, although they're not really berries. But these are also conifers. So conifers can have woody cones. Most of them do. This is a spruce cone, this is a pine cone here, a spruce cone here, and a Douglas fir cone here. So most of the conifers that you'll see will have the woody cones, although some will have the more fleshy cones like the junipers. Conifers also tend to have either needles or scale-like leaves. And this is a pine here. The pine, spruces, and firs have needles of various lengths. And the junipers have more of what look like these little scales all put together, these scale-like leaves. And the cedars kind of have the scale-like leaves too. And if you want a full list of the conifers, you can see a full list on page 27 and 28 in your text. And the following pages after that show you some pictures of what these conifers look like. Just for an overview, so you can get an idea of what you're looking for when you go out there, some of the main types of conifers are junipers, which will have this look from a distance and this look close up. The cedars, which have this look from a distance. They also have the scale-like leaves close up. This is what the cones of the cedar look like. The pines, which have typically longer needles, although some pines like lodgepole pines have needles that are just a couple inches long, and they have the woody cones here. Next we have the firs, and Douglas fir is not one of the true firs, but it does have the short needles like a true fir. So most of the firs have a little bit shorter needles than pines, but still you can definitely tell it's a needle and not a scale-like leaf. And then the spruces also have sort of shorter needles and woody cones. And so like I said, you don't need to know what your tree is that you collect this week. You just need to know that hopefully you're collecting a conifer so that you can key those out next week using the conifer key. So hopefully you have a basic idea of what you're looking for when you go out there, what a conifer is. If you accidentally collect something that's not a conifer, that's fine. It just won't be in that section of the text to key. But if you do collect something that's not a conifer, you can just keep it and key it another week. But will try to collect conifers because I think they're a little easier to start keying for your first plants to key. Here on the side, we have a few tips on collecting plants. So when you go out to collect your plants, you'll want to keep them moist until you press them. This isn't quite as big of a deal with conifers, although if they do dry out and you try to press them, all the needles will just fall off of the branches. So you want to try to keep them moist, and you can do this by placing the plants in a plastic bag that contains a wet paper towel. So when you go out to collect your conifers, first off, I'd take a pair of scissors or something with you that you can cut the branch off. Makes it a little easier rather than trying to break it off. But you'll clip off your sample and then just put it into a Ziploc bag with a wet paper towel inside. And you can keep them in that bag with the wet paper towel until you get home and can put them into your press. If you can't press them right away for some reason, you can throw them in your fridge and then put them in your press later. That'll help keep them from molding until you get them into your press. But usually within the day, you'll want to get them put into your press. Conifers aren't as sensitive to wilting as the flowering plants, so the thinner leaves and the flowering plants will wilt a lot more easily. But again, conifers, it is good to keep them somewhat moist or press them fairly quickly. And for conifers, most of the cones are too large and hard to put in your press, so you'll be taking pictures of them. We'll go over that on the next slide. So when you collect your conifer, you're going to need some pictures for your plant collection. And this, you're going to need these pictures when you turn in your final plant collection toward the end of the class. So when you take your picture, what I want you to do is place a piece of paper with the plant number on it in front of you. So if you have someone to hold the paper for you, they can hold the paper. Otherwise, you can just set the paper. I know the number's not real easy to see, but you can set the paper next to the tree or plant that you're collecting with the number on it. The reason that we do the number is because it's easy to forget which plant goes with which collection once you start getting several different plants and moving on through the course. So this number here helps you make sure that you don't lose track of what plant you've collected. Having a picture of the plant's useful also when you go to key out your plant and you need to look back at what the overall plant looks like. And you'll be putting this picture in your final digital plant collection and presentation. So for example, the first conifer that you collect is going to be plant number 1. The second conifer you collect will be plant number 2. In case you're wondering, this plant in the picture is not a conifer, but just trying to illustrate the idea of putting the piece of paper with a number on it for your collection. And then each plant that you collect after that, you'll just number them in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Some parts of the key require a description of the bark and the cones. So if you could take a picture of the bark and the cone, that would be great. If possible, you can take a sample of the bark, because sometimes the samples or the bark is small enough that you can put that into your press. Like juniper bark peels off kind of nicely. Some bark may not come off very well, and that's fine if you can't get the bark off the conifer as well. And then lastly, after you've taken your pictures, you'll clip off a piece of the tree. It's handy to have some kind of scissors or clippers when you go out collecting so that you can cut that off. And then make sure that you either number your bag or tie a tag around your plant with the plant number on it. So for example, for plant 1, it would be helpful to, on your baggie, put a number 1, get like a permanent marker and write number 1 on it, or tie a tag around the plant and put number 1 on that tag. So when you go to press your plants, what you're going to do is want to have a piece of plant that will fit onto about an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So your newspaper may be a little bit bigger than that. And if your plant's bigger, you can just trim off a piece that's about the size that will fit on a white piece of paper. If you need to have your sample be longer than that, which usually in a conifer you can just trim it, but some plants you'll want to collect a bigger piece. If you did, you can fold that plant in half. But I think for the most part, you should be able to trim your plants to the size of the paper. Then you want to make sure that your plant is arranged nicely so that the needles and leaves are lying flat. They're not lying on top of each other. The juniper is not the best example because these scale-like needles kind of go everywhere, so they do overlap just by the nature of the plant. But especially if you have a broadleaf plant with bigger leaves, you'll want to make sure those leaves are laying out nicely and not smashed on top of each other and folded over. And then, so make sure it's laid out nicely the way that you want it to look. Once you press it and dry it, then you can't rearrange your plant anymore. It will break if you try to rearrange it. So you'll place your plant between the sheet of newspaper, fold the newspaper over, put it in your press that you made in previous week, and make sure something heavy is on top of it or that you tie it up, and so that you can flatten the plant as much as possible. So the goal in your plant collection is that you have a plant that's flat and not a really thick plant. If you have a small piece of bark that you want to include in your sample, like the juniper bark is pretty thin, you can include that. If it's a really fat piece of bark, then I would not include that in your collection. For the lab this week, the only thing you'll be actually turning in online is pictures of your samples for the week. So you'll have a total of 8 samples, 2 different conifers hopefully. You'll take a picture of the whole tree. You'll take a closer up picture of the bark on the tree, a picture of the cone if it does have cones, and then you'll lay your conifer out on the newspaper getting it ready to press, and you'll take a picture of that, just showing that you're got it in your press. And so that's just your way of showing that you did your samples, collected your samples this week. If you can put all those pictures into one file, that's a lot easier to just put them into one file and upload that. And so you'll do those 4 pictures for conifer 1 and those same 4 pictures for conifer 2. If you have any questions as you go about your collecting this week or what to actually submit, feel free to let me know at any time. And I will be in touch with you again in week 3. Hope you have a great week.